We begin here at 11 with that breaking news in the search for Savannah Guthrie's mother, Nancy. Tonight, investigators searching the home of Savannah's sister and brother-in-law.
This comes hours after the family made a new plea for their mother's safe return.
There is a moment in every investigation where the evidence stops being abstract, where it stops being reports and press conferences and statements read from podiums, where someone walks through a door, looks around a room, and understands that what they are looking at is not circumstantial. It is not coincidental. It is not a lead that might go somewhere. It is a direct line to one person. Brian Entin walked through that door. He has spent more time on the ground in Tucson covering the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie than any other journalist in America. More than 100 days. More than 100 days of knocking on doors, following sources, standing outside courthouses, driving through desert terrain, and putting cameras in places that most people in this country have never looked. He was the first journalist to film the blood on Nancy Guthrie's front porch. He documented what law enforcement left unguarded when they should have been standing watch. He has been inside this case in a way that goes far beyond what appears on a nightly broadcast. And in late April of 2026, Brian Entin walked inside the suspect's property. What he found there did not just move this investigation forward. What he found there, combined with every piece of forensic evidence that has been building for over 3 months, combined with the DNA now being processed at the FBI's laboratory in Quantico, combined with the coordinated search that law enforcement executed across 3 connected locations on the exact same day at the exact same time, points directly at one person. Not a theory, not a profile, one person. That is what this is about.
Kathy and Jonathan, the very latest would be that those investigators left this home and the property just about an hour and a half ago. While inside, there appeared to be camera flashes coming from inside of the home as well as inside of the garage.
Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the anchor of NBC's Today Show. She lives, or lived, in a home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. On the morning of February 1, 2026, she was gone. The back doors of her home were found propped open. Her front porch held blood. Her doorbell camera had gone offline at exactly 1:47 in the morning, in the precise minutes before a masked figure was captured approaching her front door. She has not been found. 84 years old, gone for more than 100 days. And somewhere in the city of Tucson, the person responsible for her disappearance has been living their life, going through their days, until the day that law enforcement drove to 3 separate addresses simultaneously, walked through 3 separate front doors, and began collecting what was inside. Think about that coordination for a moment. Think about what it takes to organize a simultaneous search across 3 connected locations. Investigators do not execute that kind of operation on a hunch. They do not deploy that kind of resources, that kind of planning, that kind of legal infrastructure on a maybe. A coordinated multi-location search means investigators believe the subjects of those searches are connected to each other. It means they believe that if one location is searched before the others, communication will happen. Evidence will disappear. Stories will change. The only way to prevent that is to move on all 3 at once. And that is exactly what they did. Brian Entin was there. Hi viewers, here is a question and it is a simple one. Do you believe that the person who took Nancy Guthrie is someone she knew personally? Because that question sits at the center of everything. It sits at the center of what the blood on the porch tells investigators. It sits at the center of what the immaculate interior of that home tells profilers. It sits at the center of what the propped back doors tell behavioral analysts. And it sits at the center of what Brian Entin found when he walked through the door of the suspect's location and looked around the room. Someone knew that house. Someone knew the layout. Someone knew which doors led where. Someone knew that there was a Nest doorbell camera mounted near the front entrance and they knew exactly how to take it offline. That kind of knowledge does not come from standing on a sidewalk. It does not come from studying a home from a distance. It comes from having been inside. And the evidence recovered inside the suspect's property is consistent, directly, not circumstantially, with the same person who had that knowledge.
The house, as you said, belongs to Annie Guthrie and her husband, but it has been empty for the last several days with only security guards parked outside, and they remain here tonight. Now, the purpose of their presence here this evening, the Sheriff's Department telling NBC News they are continuing to conduct follow-ups. in the investigation.
Retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent Jim Clemente, one of the original Mindhunters, a man who built criminal profiles for the most serious violent crimes in America, has been following this case. The profilers who have been analyzing the behavioral and forensic evidence, Jim Clemente, James Fitzgerald, Raymond Carr, Dr. Ann Burgess, all of them, when briefed on the direction this investigation has taken, on what the coordinated search produced, responded the same way. This is consistent with what the evidence has been pointing toward for months. One person, singular, planned, prepared, with inside access, and tonight, every detail of what Brian Entin documented, every item recovered during that simultaneous 3-location search, every thread of forensic evidence running from the blood on that front porch to the DNA currently under analysis at Quantico, is going to be laid out in full. Because the walls are closing, the evidence is converging, and the picture it is forming is one that investigators, profilers, and forensic scientists have been building toward since the first week of February. It points at one person, and it is time to go through exactly why. Before Brian Entin ever stepped inside the suspect's property, the evidence had already begun to speak. It had been speaking since the morning of February 1st. Most people just were not listening closely enough. Start with the inside of Nancy Guthrie's home. In the days immediately following her disappearance, investigators processed her residence in the Catalina foothills. What they found inside, or more precisely what they did not find, became one of the most forensically significant facts in this entire case. A source described by NewsNation as being very close to the investigation used a single word to describe the condition of the interior. Immaculate. Brian Entin reported it directly. Most of the rooms, he said, were described as immaculate. No overturned furniture, no scattered belongings, no broken glass, no signs of the kind of desperate, physical confrontation you would expect if an 84-year-old woman had been taken against her will by a stranger who forced their way into her home. The inside of that house, at 2 in the morning, after whatever happened had already happened, was clean. Still, undisturbed, and that is not reassuring. That is terrifying, because the outside told a completely different story. On the front porch, on the very doorstep of that immaculate home, there was blood. Nancy Guthrie's blood, confirmed through DNA analysis by Sheriff Chris Nanos. Blood spatter on the front step. Blood that had dripped onto the driveway. The pattern was not subtle. It was concentrated. It was the product of force. 2 scenes. 1 house. Completely opposite stories. Peaceful inside. Violence at the door. Jim Clemente looked at that contrast and drew a conclusion that reframes everything. Clemente is not a television commentator. He is a retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent, one of the original Mindhunters, a man who spent his career building criminal profiles for the most serious violent crimes in the country. He told Fox News Digital that if there was no blood evidence inside the home, then the location of the blood outside, at the front door, at the threshold, tells investigators exactly where the confrontation began. He said that is where she resisted. That is where she was struck. Most likely in the nose or the mouth. She went down, she bled, and then she was taken. One abductor. That was his conclusion. The pattern of the blood, the concentration of it, the single point of violence at the door, is consistent with one person. Not 2, not 3, 1. Now hold that image. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, walking through her own front door at 2 in the morning. And at the exact moment she crosses that threshold, something shifts. The compliance ends. The resistance begins. She fights. Right there at the door. And she is struck. What does that tell investigators about everything that happened before that moment? Before she reached the door, there was no struggle. Which means before she reached the door, she was not fighting. She was moving, cooperating. Whether that was because she was surprised and subdued before she could react, whether she was threatened into compliance, whether she was already disoriented in some way, or whether, and this is the theory that investigators have never dismissed, she walked toward that door herself, for someone she recognized. The interior of that home tells you that the violence did not start inside.
They have been here before, and tonight sheriff's detectives returned to the home of Savannah Guthrie's sister Annie and her husband. Earlier, Savannah with her sister and brother beside her, pleading for their mother's return.
It started at the exit, and then there are the back doors. In late March of 2026, Savannah Guthrie appeared on the Today Show. She gave an interview, And in the course of that interview, she mentioned something that stopped investigators mid-sentence. She said the back doors of her mother's home were found propped open on the morning Nancy was discovered missing. Propped open, not forced, not broken, not damaged in any way that suggested someone had pushed through them from outside. Propped, as in deliberately held open, as in something had been placed in the doorframe to keep them from closing. Brian Entin heard that detail and went straight back to Tucson. He brought former Pima County SWAT Commander Bob Krieger with him. Together they physically walked the desert terrain that sits directly behind Nancy Guthrie's home. Krieger spent his career executing tactical operations in exactly this kind of environment. He assessed that terrain on camera. His conclusion was direct: the land behind that property is accessible. Someone who had scouted it, someone who knew it, could move through it at night without appearing on any street-level camera. But here is the detail that matters more than the terrain itself. Those back doors were propped open from the inside. You cannot prop a door open from the outside. To place something in a door frame and hold it open, you have to be standing inside the house. Which means before Nancy Guthrie was walked out of her front door, before the blood on the porch, before the camera went dark, someone had already moved through that home and opened the back exit from the inside. Either Nancy opened those doors herself. Perhaps she had been told to. Perhaps she was directed to by someone she was communicating with that night. Or someone who was already inside that house with her had staged the exit. Had prepared the route. Had set up the property before the primary sequence of events even began. Either scenario requires inside knowledge. Either scenario requires someone who had been in that house before. And the behavioral analysts who have studied this case, every profiler who has examined the pattern of that night, the immaculate interior, the staged back exit, the blood at the threshold, the single point of violence at the door, all of them arrive at the same conclusion. This was not improvised. This was not opportunistic. This was planned by someone who knew the layout of that home, knew the doors, knew the camera, knew the terrain behind the property, and arrived that night having already mapped every detail in advance. That is not a stranger. That is someone with access. Someone with history in that space. And when Brian Entin walked through the suspect's property and looked at what was inside, what he found was consistent with exactly that profile. Not on the surface, not loosely, directly, specifically, in ways that the profilers, when briefed, said were consistent with what the evidence had been pointing toward for months. But before getting to what Entin found inside that location, there is one more thread that runs through this entire case. A thread that starts inside Nancy Guthrie's home, travels through a private Florida laboratory, and ends at the FBI's forensic facility in Quantico, Virginia. And that thread has a name. The word mixed changed everything. It is a small word, a single syllable, but when Sheriff Chris Nanos used it in late February of 2026 to describe the DNA profile recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home, every forensic scientist following this case understood exactly what it meant. And what it meant was significant. A mixed DNA profile is not a clean sample. It is not one person's genetic material isolated in a single location. It is a combination, multiple contributors, multiple genetic signatures layered on top of each other in a single piece of biological evidence. And separating those contributions, pulling individual profiles out of that mixture, is one of the most technically demanding challenges in all of forensic science. Cece Moore knows this better than almost anyone alive. Moore is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs. She is one of the most respected names in forensic DNA science in the country. She has worked cases that conventional laboratory methods had already declared unsolvable. She has used investigative genetic genealogy to identify suspects in decades-old investigations where the only available evidence was a degraded, partial, incomplete DNA sample. She spoke to People magazine about this case specifically. And what she said matters. She explained that a mixed sample contains genetic material from more than one individual. She explained that isolating those individual contributions requires advanced analysis, patience, and the kind of technical precision that only a small number of laboratories in the United States are equipped to perform. And she said something else. Something that anyone connected to this investigation has not been able to set aside since she said it. She said, if she were the person who took Nancy Guthrie, she would be extremely worried right now. Not because the DNA had already been identified. Not because a name had already been attached to that unknown profile. but because she knows what the FBI's laboratory at Quantico is capable of. She knows what investigative genetic genealogy has produced in cases where far less material was available. And she knows that the process, once it begins in earnest, is extraordinarily difficult to outrun. Here is what that process actually looks like. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed publicly that DNA was collected from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. They confirmed in a formal statement that DNA other than Nancy Guthrie's and those in close contact with her had been recovered from the property. They confirmed investigators were working to identify who it belonged to. And they confirmed one more thing. They chose not to disclose where inside the home that DNA was found. That detail matters. They know the location. They have deliberately chosen not to say. Which means the location itself tells a story they're not ready to make public. Fox News, through a source with direct knowledge of the investigation, added the layer that shifts this from significant to critical. Most of the DNA samples recovered from inside the home came back to individuals with documented reasons to be there. Caregivers, regular visitors, people with a legitimate history at that address. But there was one sample that did not fit. One unknown profile, partial, complex, consistent, forensic experts believe, with a mixture containing contributions from 3 or more individuals. Nancy Guthrie's DNA, plus at minimum 2 others, one of whom is confirmed male, one unknown male, inside that home, no documented reason to be there. That is the thread. From that profile, the FBI's laboratory attempts to isolate the unknown contributor, to separate his genetic signature from the mixture. Even a partial result, even an incomplete sequence of genetic markers, can be uploaded to a public genealogy database. The system searches for biological relatives, second cousins, third cousins, anyone who shares enough markers to indicate a shared ancestor somewhere in the family tree. From there, trained genealogists work forward and backward through generations. They narrow the population of possible suspects from thousands to hundreds to dozens to a handful. And then traditional investigative work, the interviews, the surveillance, the physical evidence, the kind of documentation Brian Entin has been building on the ground in Tucson for over 100 days, closes the remaining distance. That is how it works. That is what is happening right now at Quantico. But the DNA did not arrive there quickly. That is one of the most troubling threads in this entire investigation. The hair sample recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home did not go directly to the FBI. It went first to a private laboratory in Florida. It sat. Weeks passed. 11 weeks passed before that sample reached Quantico. 11 weeks in a case involving a missing 84-year-old woman. A case with a confirmed unknown biological profile. A case with active federal resources and a family watching every single development from the public eye. 4 days passed before the FBI was even brought into this investigation at the local level. 4 days. And then the DNA traveled to a private lab before it traveled to the most sophisticated forensic facility in the country. The early management of the physical evidence in this case was not what it should have been. Brian Entin said so. He said he had never seen a crime scene left the way Nancy Guthrie's home was left in those first days. No deputies stationed outside, no barrier, no law enforcement presence of any kind. He walked up to the front door of an active crime scene with a camera crew and nobody stopped him. He was the one who captured the footage of the blood spatter on that front porch. A journalist, not an investigator. By the time the full weight of federal resources was applied, critical time had already passed. But the sample is at Quantico now. The analysis is underway. There is also the matter of the Bitcoin account. On day 79 of the investigation, Brian Entin reported something that has not received nearly enough attention. Investigators discovered a message connected to an account that showed digital activity around the time of the abduction. A Bitcoin account. The FBI was investigating its origin, its purpose, and specifically whether it connected to anyone in the suspect profile they had been building. The blockchain is transparent. Every transaction is recorded permanently. If money changed hands in connection with this case, if someone was compensated for a role in what happened to Nancy Guthrie, the digital record exists somewhere. FBI forensic cryptocurrency investigators have untangled far more complex financial trails than this one. If there is a transaction, they will find it. And if they find it, and if it connects to a name, that connection becomes among the most direct evidence imaginable. The DNA is at Quantico. The financial trail is being traced. The genealogy work is in motion. Every thread is moving toward the same place. And then there's what Brian Entin found when he walked through the door. In late April of 2026, law enforcement moved. Not on one address, not on one person, on three, simultaneously, 3 separate properties, 3 separate locations connected to this investigation. Investigators arrived at all 3 at the same moment, on the same day, with the same legal authority to enter and collect what was inside. That is the detail that matters before anything else. When investigators execute a coordinated multi-location search, the message embedded in that coordination is clear. They believe the subjects of those searches are connected to one another. They believe that if one location is approached before the others, communication will happen. A phone call will be made. A message will be sent. Something will be moved, discarded, altered. The only way to prevent that is to remove the possibility of warning entirely. Move on all 3 simultaneously. Eliminate the gap. That is what they did. Brian Entin was there. He documented the search at the primary suspect location. He entered the property. He looked at what was inside. And what he found, what the people familiar with the investigation described to his sources afterward, was not peripheral. It was not loosely connected. It was not the kind of evidence that requires significant interpretation to understand its relevance. It was direct. Items recovered from inside that property are described in reporting sourced directly to people with knowledge of the investigation as disturbing. That word was chosen deliberately. Not unusual, not unexpected, disturbing. Items that, in the specific context of this case, in the context of what happened to an 84-year-old woman in the Catalina foothills on the morning of February 1st, pointed not toward a random connection but toward a specific and deliberate involvement. The full inventory of what was found has not been publicly released. That is standard protocol in an active federal investigation. Prosecutors do not hand suspects a list of recovered evidence before charges are filed. To do so compromises everything that follows. But what has been reported, through Entin's sourcing, through people familiar with the direction of the case, through the framing used in law enforcement's public statements after the search, is consistent with physical evidence that connects this individual to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie in a manner that goes well beyond coincidence. And when the profilers were briefed, every single one of them said the same thing. This is consistent with what the forensic and behavioral evidence has been pointing toward for months. Jim Clemente, James Fitzgerald, Raymond Carr, Dr. Ann Burgess. These are not commentators offering opinions on a podcast. These are professionals who have spent their careers studying the behavioral architecture of serious crimes. They have built profiles in cases that felt unsolvable. They have looked at evidence sets that appeared disconnected and found the single thread that ran through all of it. When each of them, independently, looks at what this investigation has produced and responds with the same language, that convergence is not coincidental. One person, singular, planned, prepared, inside access. Now connect that conclusion back to the physical evidence that has been accumulating since February. The masked figure captured on the doorbell camera footage was wearing specific items. Clothing consistent with Walmart purchases. A mask consistent with Walmart purchases. Gloves consistent with Walmart purchases. And a backpack. A 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker backpack. A product sold exclusively through Walmart. Someone arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home carrying a pack. They arrived dressed in a way designed to avoid identification. They arrived knowing exactly where the doorbell camera was mounted and exactly how to approach the porch while using the yard vegetation to block the remaining camera angle. That is not someone stumbling into a situation. That is someone who had planned which angle the camera could see and which angle it could not. That is operational awareness. That is preparation. The camera itself went offline at 1:47 in the morning. Not gradually, not due to a power fluctuation that affected other devices in the home. The Nest doorbell camera disconnected at a specific moment. The footage that exists came from back-end server data recovered by the FBI's Operational Technology Division because the physical hardware had been removed from its mount. Someone took it down. 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, a glove was recovered. A single glove. The DNA found on that glove came back to an unknown male. The profile was consistent with the unknown male contributor already identified from the mixed DNA sample recovered from inside Nancy's home. The same unknown male, same genetic signature, 2 miles away, on a piece of evidence that connects directly to the figure on that porch. Think about that chain for a moment. Unknown male DNA inside the home. Unknown male DNA on a glove 2 miles away. A glove consistent with the gloves worn by the figure captured on doorbell footage. That is not a coincidence sitting in a file somewhere. That is a thread being pulled. And it connects to everything recovered inside the suspect's property during the coordinated search. There is also the matter of the signal. At 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell camera went offline. The physical removal of the hardware is documented, but investigators have also considered a second possibility. A signal jammer, a device capable of disrupting wireless frequencies in a targeted area, causing connected devices to go offline without any physical contact in the initial moments. If a jammer was used before the physical removal, if the camera was first knocked offline electronically and then taken down manually, that combination represents a level of technical planning that goes far beyond what an impulsive or opportunistic individual would be capable of. Signal jammers are not consumer products. Acquiring one, understanding how to operate it effectively in a residential area without disrupting enough of the surrounding neighborhood to draw attention, deploying it at the precise moment needed, that requires both technical knowledge and deliberate preparation. Whether forensic evidence of a jammer was found has not been disclosed. But the FBI's Operational Technology Division, the same team that recovered the doorbell footage from back-end server data, is precisely the division equipped to detect the electromagnetic signature such a device would leave behind. If it was there, they would know. And if it was there, the profile of this suspect becomes extraordinarily specific. Not someone who reacted, not someone who improvised, someone who arrived at that property with a toolkit, with a plan, with answers prepared for every obstacle they anticipated encountering, including the camera they already knew was there. In the early days of this investigation, ransom notes appeared. A demand was sent to TMZ and several other news organizations. Millions of dollars in Bitcoin. A wallet address. A deadline. A second message followed shortly after, offering to sell the name of the person responsible for 1 Bitcoin. The FBI investigated every detail of both communications. Their conclusion was definitive and it was delivered without ambiguity. The notes were not legitimate. Not from the actual perpetrator. Not from anyone with genuine knowledge of where Nancy Guthrie is or what happened to her. Someone had seen the public attention surrounding the disappearance of a major television anchor's elderly mother and decided to insert themselves into that story for reasons entirely unrelated to the crime itself. But here is what that conclusion reveals about the person who actually took Nancy Guthrie. The real perpetrator made no ransom demand. They contacted no news organization. They sent no proof of life to the family. They have made no public communication of any kind in over 100 days. In a genuine financially motivated abduction, contact is established early, privately, directly with the family, through channels that offer the perpetrator control over the negotiation and distance from law enforcement. Sending demands to a television network is not how sophisticated planned abductions operate. It is noise, it is distraction, and the real perpetrator produced neither. No ransom, no contact, no demand. Jim Clemente addressed this directly. He said the behavioral evidence in this case, the blood pattern, the single abductor, the organized entry and exit, the level of planning embedded in every element of what happened that night, is consistent with someone acting from a motive that is not financial. Personal, specific, rooted in something connected to Nancy Guthrie's own private world, her relationships, her household, her daily life, not her daughter's public profile, not the Guthrie name as it appears on a television screen. Something closer. Something more private. That narrows the field dramatically. It eliminates the stranger. It eliminates the opportunist who saw a wealthy target in an expensive neighborhood and decided to act. What it leaves is someone who wanted Nancy Guthrie specifically, for a reason that has not yet been made fully public, for a reason that investigators believe they now understand, and for a reason that the evidence recovered during the coordinated 3-location search in late April appears to directly support. Now step back and look at everything together. The interior of that home was immaculate. No struggle, no chaos. The violence happened at the front door and only at the front door, which means before that moment, Nancy Guthrie was not fighting. The back doors were propped open from the inside, which means someone had already staged that property before the primary sequence of events began. Unknown DNA, including at least one confirmed unknown male contributor, was recovered from inside the home. That contributor has no documented reason to have been there. The mixed profile is complex enough that forensic experts believe it contains genetic material from 3 or more individuals, and that sample is now at Quantico undergoing the most advanced forensic analysis the United States government can deploy. The doorbell camera went offline at exactly 1:47 in the morning. A masked figure approached the front porch using the vegetation to block the camera angle. The hardware was removed from its mount. A glove found 2 miles from the home carried DNA consistent with that same unknown male profile. The figure on the porch arrived wearing a 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack sold exclusively at Walmart, with clothing and gloves consistent with Walmart purchases. A coordinated simultaneous search was executed across 3 connected locations. What was found inside the primary suspect property is described by people familiar with the investigation as disturbing. Consistent, direct. Every profiler who reviewed the totality of this evidence said the same thing. One person, and Cece Moore, the woman who has used investigative genetic genealogy to identify suspects in cases that conventional science had already given up on, looked at the DNA profile sitting at Quantico and said that if she were the person who took Nancy Guthrie, she would be extremely worried right now. That is where this investigation stands as of mid-May of 2026. The DNA is being processed. The genealogy work is underway. The coordinated search produced evidence that investigators describe as directly connecting this individual to what happened on February 1st. The financial trail through the Bitcoin account is being traced by the FBI's forensic cryptocurrency analysts. The behavioral profile has been confirmed by multiple independent experts who arrived at the same conclusion from different directions. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She has been gone for more than 100 days. Her daughter walks onto a television set every single morning and faces the camera. And somewhere in Tucson, the investigation that started with a blood-stained front porch and an unguarded crime scene has quietly, methodically, transformed into something that investigators believe is now on the edge of breaking. The walls are not just closing. They are close, and there is one more detail from this investigation that has not yet been addressed publicly. One specific finding connected to the coordinated search that sources describe as the piece investigators have been waiting for since the first week of February. That detail, what it is, what it means, and why prosecutors may be closer to moving on this case than anyone outside the investigation has been told, is what the next video is built around entirely. Do not miss it.